So we are thrilled and delighted with this partnership. And Bill, thank you for your willingness to walk alongside with us. And we're grateful you can lead us in this very important topic today. So without any further conversation, Dr. Bill Wilson, who is the director of the Center for Healthy Churches, a good friend, and you will enjoy this time with us. So Bill, thank you.
Thank you, Danny. And thank you all, 37 of you, for taking the time to be a part of this. Like you, I spend a good bit of my life, it seems, on Zoom. Wish I had bought stock in Zoom a year ago. I probably would have bought it in Skype instead, and whatever happened to Skype, by the way, But aren't you glad we have this format if for no other reason than we get to stay connected? By the way, of the 37 of you, about 28 of you have chosen not to share your video with me, which is fine. Although I would love to see you at some point in the presentation. If you're eating breakfast, it doesn't bother me. If you're not dressed, let's plan on just holding off on that. But there you are. Thank you for some of you. But if you prefer not to, I certainly understand. I appreciate the fact that you've made the effort to be a part of this. Back in March, Danny and I were planning a tour of about 7 or 8 different cities and churches around the theme of turnaround leadership. Remember that, Danny? It seems like a long time ago. And we literally, at the last minute, had to pull the plug because we were starting the 3rd week in March. And we'll hopefully get back to that one day. But in the meantime, we want to continue to look for opportunities to partner. I had a great experience a couple of weeks ago with a class at Gardner-Webb, and have just continued to appreciate the things you do and talk to your students on a regular basis. So I want to do a couple of things. One is to share a slide deck and talk over it a bit, but I also want to hear from you. And I want to confess on the front end, I am not an expert any more than you are. I am an observer. I can see my part of the world, my part of the art of the elephant, if you like the old Hindu fable, and you've got another part of the elephant, and between us, we might be able to figure out what this thing looks like. So as I share with you, what I'm sharing with you is my perspective from my seat. It is not intended to be exhaustive or inerrant. It really is just an observation, and I would absolutely welcome your thoughts and input. We're recording this, right, Aaron? And if you would like to access it later, I'm sure there'll be a way to do that. And that would include the slide deck. So hopefully that'll be available to you. So let me pull that up real quick and begin down that path. Part of what I want to do is quickly introduce myself a little more and the organization I work with, but jump right into our topic. What you see is doing church, and we picked that word deliberately more than thinking about or whatever. This is an action-focused idea and conversation along 2 sort of thematic paths. One is the survival notion, which I think many of us are still in. How do we get through the initial surge of uncertainty and the realization that we are in a place we have never been before? We're far off the map as a church. And then how do we begin to look not just at what's next, but as a friend of mine said, what's next? How do we think longer term than Thanksgiving? And that actually is long-term planning these days. To go all the way to the 3rd week in November nowadays is a long way off. So I want to explore these kind of twin ideas with you. Just a reminder, the Center for Healthy Churches is an organization. Our focus is on helping and healing and providing hope to congregations. We really think, when you think about healthy churches, we're talking about a 4-legged stool, so to speak, a community of Christ followers that have a shared vision, thriving ministry, and some element of trusted leadership. And we don't all hit 1,000 on all those all the time, but we hope they're all present in some form or fashion in a healthy church. And we do a lot of different things, some vision work, a good bit of leadership transition. I think right now I counted this week 16, 17 churches we're helping find senior pastors or youth or music or executive pastor type folks. Unfortunately, an increasing amount of conflict, transformation work, and then a good bit of work with staff and particular tasks that they're involved in. And it's not just me. There's a big crowd behind me, like the AT&T commercial. I've got about 25 people on the team, and that's expanding. Our work is growing. Actually, in the last 60 days, we have had about a 75% increase in requests for assistance, which I think actually reflects another trend that we'll talk about among congregations. And that is transdenominational. I was on yesterday with Presbyterians in Detroit. I was with a UCC church in New Jersey, a Presbyterian church in Philadelphia, a Baptist church in Nashville, several of them in North Carolina, a Lutheran church in Nashville. I'm learning to speak a multi-denominational language, which is fun. And I was a pastor, youth minister and pastor for about 35 years, and then came to the Wake Forest Hospital 11 years ago, and then 7 years ago, we began the center. So enough about me. So doing church in the midst of the pandemic, and these two ideas, surviving and thriving. And what would those look like if we were thinking about the local church? Now, one quick question I'd have, I can't see everyone. Let's see if I can pull up. If you are a minister in a local church, you just give me a thumbs up. I can, yeah, there we go. So the majority of our folks looks like are local church. There are some lay people on the call, or some people who are bivocational, I would think. There you go. And so I'm hoping that this appeals to both, so to speak. And again, this is, the disclaimer is this is not the voice of God. This is just one person looking out over the landscape and kind of telling you what I see from coast to coast and through lots of different perspectives. So let's jump into this a bit and see what we can come up with. I've got a half a dozen things that I see on the surviving side of this equation, and then I've got a half a dozen things I want to talk about on the thriving side. My experience of the last 7-8 months is that we've all shifted from sprinting. We thought this was going to be about a 40-yard dash, then maybe a 100-yard dash. And then we realized this might be more like a 5K. And then we started awakening to the fact that this is probably more along the lines of a marathon. And if someone told me the other day, he said, "No, Bill, this is an Ironman triathlon. 100 miles on a bike, and 10 miles in the water, and so many miles running." This is a lengthy process. One of the things that I have seen people begin to shift from is either or thinking and toward a kind of both and model. And here's a couple of ways that I've seen that unfold. There's a tendency in the midst of all of the things that are happening to us to either awfulize the situation and absolutely get immobilized and frozen in place because we're so incredibly fearful. And on the other kind of extreme, to minimize the situation. To say it's just a passing fad. It's not even as bad as the flu. Don't worry about that mask, kind of thing. And sadly, we've got national leaders on both sides of that equation kind of encouraging that sort of thinking, either to awfulize or minimize or even trivialize the pandemic. I hope, as a pastor or as a leader in a church, that either or thinking usually takes you to a dark place, winner loser kind of situations. Both and thinking is generally where healthier churches reside and healthier clergy spend a lot of their time. So it can be both an awful situation and it can be a situation where we can still function. We don't have to stop being God's people. And I've heard people on both extremes, and neither of those is healthy. So one of the first things I would want to say is help your people balance out that awful minimal kind of polarity. Another that I hear occasionally out there in the survival mode is someone over spiritualizing this thing, and the other would be under spiritualizing this thing. It's all science or it's all religion, you know? And so we want to think, no, it's both science and faith. We do walk by faith and not by sight, but that doesn't mean, as some prominent clergy has suggested, that if you just have enough faith, you just believe God and trust God enough, this thing's not going to get you. Well, come on, we know better than that. But on the other side, we're not simply scientists. We do have some degree of faith to bring to the equation. God's people have been in pandemics before. God's people have been in horrible situations before, and we can learn from those stories and those experiences how to avoid the temptation either to be so heavenly minded we're no earthly good, so to speak, and also to be so secular that we even forget that we follow a pretty amazing and awesome God. So the idea of congregational life, are we open or are we closed? And this really isn't as much an issue as it was early on. Remember the early days, we would repeatedly say, we're not closed, we've just changed location. One guy told me, he said, I have 400 church members. We now have 400 satellite locations for our church. We're absolutely open for business. We're still engaged in the life of faith as a people of God. You may have some other either or thinking out there. I won't even get into politics and all the other places in life that gets bifurcated. I think one thing I would say, survival in the pandemic, the survival skill is to lead people away from win, lose, either or thinking and toward a both and model. And that can affect everything from how do we open? Well, we may have some people on campus, but we know based on everything we're seeing across the country, if you start church back, you're going to be fortunate to have 1/3 of your regular attenders attend. And so if that's all you offer, then you've really lost a significant portion of your congregation. On the other hand, if you can blend both in-person and virtual, some amazing things can happen. I was talking with a church in Nashville yesterday that suspended all services and then they've actually begun now small group Bible studies, but they do it in a very unique way. They have a television monitor in each room. They have a camera. They've set up their own Zoom account for each class. And what they're finding is that people can either come or join the class virtually. This guy was telling me that their senior adult attendance is up 20% over what it was in February when you count the combined virtual and physical presence. Well, that's a good example of either or thinking giving way to both and. Number two, if I've heard this word once, I've heard it 10,000 times. The fatigue factor is setting in. There's even, Zoom fatigue and all sorts of fatigues are out there. I'm starting to sense, and I'm sure many of you are as well, that this is the price of our maybe thinking we had a short-term disruption, giving way to the sinking realization that we're talking months and perhaps years, sadly, and not just a few days or weeks. So there's the physical fatigue. One of the things I'm finding more and more, I had a pastor tell me yesterday, Bill, I'm exhausted. And I feel like I'm not doing a lot of the things that I used to do, but I am doing things that are emotionally and physically draining for me. And that led to a conversation about spiritual fatigue. How do I keep being the voice of hope and encouragement when I'm not feeling it myself? I think there's emotional fatigue. If you have children and you're home and you're trying to manage the schooling situation, whether they're in person or online, if you've got a spouse who's also managing a career or whatever is going on. My mother yesterday got locked down for a fresh 14 days in her assisted living. Well, my sister was literally at the door to take her to a doctor's appointment, and they had to physically turn my mother around and walk her back into the room. My sister and my mom were emotionally distraught. And those are things we're just not really wired to manage well when they happen repeatedly. I don't know about you, but I'm seeing more and more of my friends come down with the virus, not just people, in New York or Lower Georgia, whatever. These are real people, real clergy. Some very sad stories out there, and it's wearing us out. Here's one I heard this week. A gal told me, I think our people are suffering from decision fatigue. Do we open? Do we close? How far apart do we send? Do we have bulletins? What are we going to do about Thanksgiving? What about Christmas? She said, I got into an argument with somebody the other day about Bible school next year. So we're just inundated with fatigue around decisions. And this one, and she said, and I'm so tired of people telling me what they think, their opinions. She said, I'm tired of everybody pretending to be an expert on medical care or on higher education or on church. And so this notion of just constantly grinding away at these issues is it has an eroding effect on people's stamina. And the effect of fatigue long term is exhaustion. And I don't need to tell you, among clergy life, that one of the most predictable things that happens to us is when we are expending our energy and not taking in energy, we verge frequently on a kind of burnout lifestyle. My sense is we're about to get hit by a wave of people leaving the ministry in droves. Many of them are going to be my age, who are, in their 60s, the boomers, as they realize, man, the new church that's emerging is going to require some things I'm not sure I want to do. And they're going to go ahead and take retirement or step away a little early. But others are people who just think this is exhausting in a way that's not good for my health, spiritually, physically, emotionally, relationally. The uncertainty fatigue. When will this end? How will this end? What are we going to do to get us through this thing? There's just massive uncertainty. And so one of the things I think when we talk about surviving is finding resources to re-energize ourselves. If I were a doctor and could write you a prescription, I would write you, I'd give you a prescription, just 3 days off in a row with no cell phone. And you'd go, yeah, right, that'll never happen. I'd go, bud, it better happen. In fact, I had that very conversation with a 58-year-old minister yesterday. I think if you're going to make it to the end of the year, you have got to get away and recharge those batteries. Your phone won't work when the batteries are out, and neither will you. So whatever that looks like, and it looks differently for all of us, but just to be able to name it and to say, beware that survival when you are exhausted is extremely difficult. My guess is you could name some other fatigues. I haven't even thrown in there family, marriage, politics, all the other things that are pulling us down. All right, I'm gonna run through these 6 and then stop and get your feedback on this. Number 3, one of the things I'm seeing as a kind of survival skill is to rethink how far out we have to plan and prepare for. I think our new normal is that most planning is going to be in 10-day increments and probably max out at about 8 weeks. If you think you can tell me what's going to be happening during Advent this year, I'm real interested in knowing how you're getting at that. And because that's only 6 weeks away, maybe 5 weeks. I got a feeling that the new normal is we have to almost recalibrate every week as a church, as a staff, as a leadership team, based on what's happened since we last met. And I'm thinking staff meetings or leadership team meetings. If you're the only minister, you pull together 3 or 4 key leaders. It's going to become a regular conversation, whereas we used to be able to do 90, 180, 365 planning. I don't think that's the norm anymore. Can you tell me what you think America is going to look like on November 4th, for example, 3 weeks from yesterday? Well, no. I think we're all a little afraid, but when that election's over, we're going to recalibrate again. Don't write your sermon until the end of that week, because the world is going to change that week in some form or fashion in ways we can't really see. So one of the things that is, regardless of your age, and by the way, I know 68-year-old clergy who are more flexible than 28-year-old clergy. I see it all the time. Your flexibility is essential for holding your people together. Now, how do you get more flexible? Well, I can tell you, I've been going to a physical therapist. In fact, I'm going in 2.5 hours. I'll have a lovely visit with Tyler. He's going to work me over. Tyler, who I love and hate at the same time. And the way you get more flexible is you stretch and you exercise and you're disciplined about your flexibility. And so one of the things I think survival skills that you and I really need to work on is exercising to become more flexible. The calcification, if you will, that ministry and the institution of the church tends to produce in us is not unlike arthritis in our bones. We begin to think there's only one way to do something. And we actually, even though we don't believe it, we practice it. So one of the things that, aren't you proud of the church, that in February, less than about 40% of churches in America had some kind of an online worship experience. You know what that percentage is today? 98. And it went to like 94% in 6 weeks. Who would have predicted that the American church, the mom and pops, all the way to the megachurches, would realize the value of doing what we're doing here right now and be able to pull that off? So there is hope here, and that's a skill set that we're going to need to feed and nurture a bit. And so use this word every time you get a chance. We're going to have to be nimble. We're going to have to be nimble. That has not usually been the way we described our local churches. We've been more oil tankers than jet skis. And what we're going to have to really think about is, how do we become more nimble? Agile is another phrase, another word. If you've ever heard of agile planning or agile planning, comes out of computer science. I learned about it over in Huntsville, working with a church with a bunch of rocket scientists. And they described for me how in agile planning, this is NASA, they recalibrate their plan every week. Every week. I said, what are you planning? He said, Mars. I said, tell me more. He said, I'd have to kill you if I told you. I said, we're going to Mars. He said, I didn't say that. But he said, I've been on this project for 14 years. We recalibrate our plan every Monday morning. I said, I think that's what churches are going to have to do. He said, welcome to my world. To be nimble, to be agile, to be flexible. All right, number 4. Boy, the things that I'm hearing about leadership, lay and clergy, that trouble me in terms of survival is we're not paying very close attention to some things that are unintended consequences of this pandemic. One of the clearest issues is boundary violations. The old days when you went to the office and then you went home are no more. Some of you today are in your homes, which are now your offices, and vice versa. And what I'm hearing from clergy of all ages is it's harder and harder for me to know when I'm at work and when I'm not. And not just for me, but for my children, for my spouse. And I'm finding myself, as one confessed to me, never being off. I'm constantly on. And whereas before I literally would put the phone down and go out and play with the kids, said, I am so anxious now. My screen time the other day came up. He said, my screen time was up 40% over a week ago. And it's called doom scrolling. You heard that one? Doom scrolling, where you just start reading about the pandemic or about, I don't know, your favorite politician or whatever. And you clickbait your way up through, you look up and it's been an hour and a half. And that can bleed over into this kind of incessant, we're always at work. So those boundary issues are significant, and healthy, thoughtful, mindful clergy especially, and even lay leaders are going to have to learn to start saying, I've got to have some better boundaries here. Not sure what that looked like for you. I know what it looked like for me. It meant putting that dang phone down and turning it off. And saying there are some other people who can cover if something bad happens and can reach me. The fear that is pervading many clergy, especially younger clergy who are maybe not at the top of the food chain in their church, is palpable. They see the financial concerns swelling in the life and the eyes of the congregation. And there's a lot of anxiety among clergy, especially younger clergy, and even some older clergy. Am I going to have a job? Some of the people that have been most vocal about that with me are ministers of music or people who do worship, because they haven't been able to work, or what they've been doing feels like, it's a skill set they don't really have. But there's a pervasive, unrelenting fear in many clergy, especially about their future in ministry. The workload, and I heard this week I hear it regularly from lay people. I'm working with a lot of search committees. The workload that people ask of others in this season is significant. And it kind of goes with boundaries, that we're not giving people a chance to say no or to have any downtime. There are plenty of other staff and volunteer leadership issues, but those are a few that I think, in terms of surviving, somebody needs to be paying attention to the lifestyle boundaries of clergy and other leaders, addressing the fear, reassuring as much as possible, and being careful about just kind of divvying up more and more work on people, especially skills that we weren't trained to do. And it takes us twice as long to do something as it does a 13-year-old, because we're all thumbs kind of thing. All right, 2 more. The financial stressors are real. There's 11 Sundays left in this year. And for many of your churches, they're some of the most important Sundays you'll ever have, meaning not so much Sunday worship, but there's 11 giving units or giving weeks left in this year. One of the things that is especially concerning to me from where I sit is this surge that seems to be coming of the twindemic of flu and COVID and how it might impact our giving patterns. The Lake Institute, some of you know that, out of Indianapolis, is one of the best. It's a Lilly-funded organization that just did probably the largest study on congregational giving this year. And I want to show a couple things to you about that. I got this, before I get to that, a couple of graphs. This is a graph that shows the new virus cases per day. And you can see the initial surge back in March and April. That was primarily located in the Northeast. And then the big surge we had in the summer when we were hoping for a reduced amount of new cases. And now you see the fall surge has begun. And you can see that Europe, and was announced today, has caught back up with us. And if they are the canary in the mine, it's not a good scene. What's coming out of Spain and Germany and England is not a pretty picture. But the only place that's having any luck with this, by the way, is Australia. And I'll go if you will. We'll just, of course, they wouldn't let us come because we're coming from the United States, but they seem to have figured some things out that other people have not. This is another piece that came out today. This third surge is coming. The first one back in April. The second one that really came as people began to relax or the virus spread, and then we used mask and everybody sort of played by the rules, and now the relaxation of that, the beginning of school, and the fact that even with the best guidelines, people in the White House, when Nick Saban and the athletic director at University of Alabama both get it, and they're in a kind of bubble environment, then it gives you a sense of just how lethal things are going to be in the next few weeks and months. Well, what does this mean financially? Well, if you want to look at the full study, this is the website, and you can catch it later if you want, or I'll be glad to. Maybe, Aaron, you could send this out as a chat to everybody. This study is fascinating. A couple of key findings. It really just ran about 4 months of data, surveyed about 10,000 churches. A significant number of churches, the largest percentage, reported a drop in receipts. By the way, this is just through June. So this doesn't count the last 4 months. A few churches, very few, I think 6 or 7% reported an increase in giving, and about a similar kind of percentage reported a no change in giving. But a significant number of churches did report fall off in giving. Overall, through June, receipts to American churches were down about 6%. So there is document. It's not as bad as we were afraid. When this thing first hit, I remember telling people, if I were you, I'd do a 75% budget right away and start living by it. But there's no question that one of the survival skills that you're going to need as a congregation is to make do with less income. I think that 6% may well double by the end of the year for most churches, especially if this next wave hits our senior adults as hard as it sounds like it's going to hit us. Thinking ahead, in the middle of the year, about half the churches were expecting a smaller budget in 2021. About half were thinking the same, and almost no one was thinking that they would increase giving. So their survival strategy was hunker down, pull back for the most part, or stay still. My guidance for you, for what it's worth, is immediately go to a 90% budget. I think you're probably at the peak of your financial prowess right now for the next 3 to 5 years. Wherever you are, this is as good as it's going to be for a while. and start thinking, how do we live on what we got and not expect a big, a big surge in giving on VJ Day, when this thing goes away, because that probably is not going to happen in the same way that a lot of us fantasize about. All right, last one. The other challenge that I see in terms of a survival skill of late is, how do you stay unified in the midst of a culture that is absolutely fragmenting? Racially, politically, economically. We have 2 recoveries underway, you know that. The folks who are invested in the stock market are smiling. The folks who are earning income and living paycheck to paycheck are weeping. And we have a fragmented culture in so many ways. So how do we manage that? Well, I've just suggested 3 things here that I seem rather obvious. Your voice in the pulpit or with the people that you influence is a critical one in terms of teaching and preaching a biblical worldview, a Jesus worldview that is the view of unity and not fragmentation. That there are things that bind us together that we want to focus on rather than all the things that pull us apart. Not only in preaching and teaching, but in practice. If there was ever a season where congregations need to up their game on pastoral care, I don't mean the pastor delivering the care, but truly caring for one another deeply, it's right now. What I hear from congregants across the country is the thing that matters most to them about their church is that feeling that somebody cares about me. And if they can't see you on Sunday, they don't know if you care for them or not, if you're not letting them know. So whatever that looks like, and I would think it would look like a weekly contact, at least, from leadership to every single member. And I know that sounds like a lot, but I can't say enough how important that is to maintaining unity. And then EQ is your best friend, emotional intelligence, learning to read the room. Don't lead with your chin in a divided culture. Don't go looking for a fight. Watch your mouth. Be careful what you say. People are on edge. I've had to apologize on Zoom calls, in person, for things I said I did not mean to. It came across, and in a normal culture, it would have been no big deal. But nowadays, whether it's a microaggression or an overt aggression, it doesn't matter. I got to watch my mouth. And so do you. We want to err on the side of the voice of care and concern, and not, let's talk about all the ways we're different from one another. All right, those are my quick glance at some survival skills or some issues that I think are more about survival. Let me stop there and say, does that resonate with your life? And what would you add, or anything you want to challenge there? Or I'm open to anything. And Aaron, if you've got some things from folks that have sent those to you via the chat feature, we can talk about it. If somebody has something they want to say, we can unmute as well.
Nothing via the chat window yet. But one of the questions that I had, I guess maybe to get us started here, Bill, because one of the scholarships I work with here at the university has to do with ministry. And there has been a trend over the last several years that it's harder to get 18-year-olds to realize that call to ministry. And it's happening later and later in life, at least from our perspective, or at least later in their college years. And I wonder, you mentioned all the things about fatigue. I wonder if fatigue about giving the call to ministry is in play here. And you were talking about the number of pastors that will be retiring or retiring early, and there's going to be this gap. And part of my concern, because I deal with the scholarship of students who are going into theological education, as I see the recipient numbers go down, my concern is, well, who's going to pastor the churches? And so I think it's this vicious cycle of we're not actively engaging in calling people to ministry. And I mean, not that God is not calling, but that we are not making that an intentional part of our service. And I think that may be even more so now, when they can't go to camp and hear from the camp preacher. They can't go to the retreat and hear it on the retreat. And now all of a sudden, well, who is, articulating for these students, hey, you may be feeling the call. And that may be the case for adults that are called to ministry as well. So I just wonder what you may have seen or heard about around that, the call to ministry.
We could spend a week on that. I'm looking at Dr. Stiebel, Dr. West would I'm sure echo what I'm about to tell you. We have a major crisis of shortage of people entering ministry. Let's just name it. I'm the chairman of the board of a seminary right now that's closing. That's closed. And I've worked with ATS, the Theological Schools Accreditation Organization, for the last 2 years. 20% fewer people are in divinity school and seminary now that were in those places 10 years ago. In 1 decade, we're down 20%. The washout rate for clergy, according to Lilly, is 50% after 5 years graduation from divinity school or seminary. It's higher than public education, which is the worst. It means that when people go into ministry, many of them go into toxic churches and get a taste of it and say, that's not for me. That isn't what I had in mind. So we have both a pipeline issue, and we have a very challenging culture in many congregations. The reasons are multifold and complex and would take weeks to unpack. One of which, though, Aaron, is, you are right, we are not creating what we call a culture of call in most congregations. And to do so is an overt, proactive effort to introduce the idea that God is still calling men and women, young and old, into ministry. It may not always be full-time with full benefits, but there are opportunities there that we want to raise as possibilities. We did at my last church, we made an overt, proactive approach toward calling people to ministry. We had gone 22 years without anyone entering the ministry. This is a church of 2,000 people. And in 2 years, we had 7 people commit. Just because we began to deliberately make it a part of the conversation in our youth ministry, in our worship services, even in our deacon ministry. And so I'm sure I would speak for the people at Gardner-Webb. We got to do a better job of recruiting, or at least raising the possibility, even though, our role as clergy and our status in every kind of scaling that you do, survey work, clergy used to be near the top, and thanks to all the scandals, we're now down there with used car salesmen. We're not seen as the icons or the epitomes of integrity or of faithfulness. And that, I don't have an answer for you. I think we can describe the problem well. What I'm grateful for are people like Dr. Stiebel, Dr. West, and Dr. this and that at your place, who raise up the possibility that God is still calling people to ministry. To me, there's never been a greater time to be in the ministry. We've never been more needed. I'm the father of a pastor or minister who was voted in my family least likely to go into the ministry when he was in high school and college. And God touched him. And, it was on the mission field that he really felt the call, and he is doing amazing things. But, we got to expose these folks to the joys of ministry and not just the challenges. So that's a long answer, but it's a soapbox of mine that I couldn't be more passionate about.
You mentioned Dr. Stiebel and her question request. She said in her divinity class, you address spiritual intelligence. and she asked that you weave some of that into the dialogue.
Yeah, I've got so much of it, Sophia. I wish I had more. So EQ, a lot of times I'll talk about emotional intelligence, which many of you know that's a kind of a corporate language. Comes from the work of Daniel Goleman, Jewish therapist in New York. But if you fold in the EQ traits to the fruit of the Spirit, what I think, if you marry those together, what you get is spiritual intelligence. It is a kind of deeply rooted, profoundly mature faith that is also horizontally focused. So that's the vertical dimension of our faith, to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But to love your neighbor as yourself is to put that crossbar on the cross and to say, how do I have relational intelligence to go with my spiritual intelligence? And I love the marriage of EQ and SQ. In fact, we need to write that book because it absolutely is at the heart of effective ministry, both among clergy and lay people, to blend a love for God with a love for people. Because I know people who love God and are jerks. You know, they make everybody they come in contact with unhappy. And I know people who love other people and they don't have anything to offer them except a good time. So the marriage of vertical meaning and horizontal connectiveness is, I think, a very healthy way to think about life in ministry and life in general. So.
Well, as of right now, I don't have any other
Oh,
questions.
good. We've answered every question.
Are there any other?
Jerry's got something.
Yep, I got something. Hi, Bill. How
Hi,
are
Jerry.
you?
Good. Tell them who you are, because this is fun for you to be on here.
Yeah, I'm the church administrator at Westminster Presbyterian in Westchester. And
tell them how we know each other.
And so we hired Bill
Thank
3
you,
years
Jerry.
ago.
Good
I
job.
guess it's 17, right? Bill came out and we did a vision plan, 3 to 5 year plan with Bill. And it was just amazing success. And of course, everything ground to a halt in March. We still have our vision teams trying to do that work, being the church, if you will. It's a great church, but I think one of the challenges, and Bill, I wanted you to speak to this. You know, you've always talked about churches are in that 1980s staffing model, and we need to change. And obviously, this virus has accelerated that, really. And that's the struggle we're having. We had somebody just announce the retirement at the end of the year in the children's area. And one of the problems we have is we have this tease right now where we still have a lot of dedicated givers, and our numbers are not looking that bad. And we're looking at our budget for next year, and we have a worst case at minus 10%. And I heard what you said, just go to a 90% budget right away. The challenge is, do we look at staffing changes, or do we look at reduction in salaries? And I'm thinking particularly in the music ministry area, because we have 2 people that are making a lot of money and they're really not doing anything close to that. So that's one of the challenges we have. How do we get people to really want to talk about what is very uncomfortable right now?
Right. Thank you, Jerry. And by the way, Jerry is a wonderful layperson who's administrator in his congregation, a major significant force there, and a great church. Their pastor, Dick Lincoln's a wonderful leader in the PCUSA. I want to talk about that in just a moment as one of the ways that I think churches can thrive, and it has to do with configuration of staff and a reconfiguration of staff. Most of us are staffed for where we have been, not where we're going. And a good example, and I am not picking on music ministers. My mom would string me up by my thumbs because she was one. But many of our staffing models around music are geared around robe choirs, children's choirs, handbells, senior adult choir, graded choirs, whatever. a full program, and that hadn't been true in most churches in a long time. And so I deal with music ministers all the time saying, I'm trying to reinvent myself, and it's really hard. And then we also deal with plenty of them who are saying, I'm just trying to hold on to retirement so I can get out of here, and we'll leave it to somebody else to. And the music area in most churches is one of the looming challenges when you go to hire, because you all know, maybe you don't, that in the Baptist family, I'll speak for the Baptist family, there are no seminary programs for church musicians left. In terms of classically trained music, there's not a single one. In the 6 Southern Baptist seminaries and the startup seminaries, there are very few. And even in divinity schools, there are very few. And so the pipeline, you talk about the faucet has been cut off of the feeder system for the next generation. And what many congregations are discovering is, number one, as he implied, the workload has lightened dramatically or changed dramatically. And then the supply pool of candidates has also shifted dramatically. And it's going to require some real thinking. I'm going to talk about it in just a minute. In fact, I'm looking at the clock. Can I go ahead and jump to my next, sort of the better news, so to speak? Darren, anything else we need to address right now before we jump there?
No, I think we're good, Bill. Let's go ahead to the good news.
And there's all good news, you know. It's not like this is bad, but it's just a little different. All right. So if those are the challenges, here's what I see as opportunities and things that I believe we're going to continue to unfold and with some kind of hopefulness. Number one, this is the season, if you've ever wanted it, to innovate and be creative. Permission granted. And it started the second week in March, and it hasn't stopped. Now, some of us thought that the limits of our creativity were we went to Facebook Live on worship. Way to go. That's the tip of the iceberg. There is a season that you are in right now where you can engage what corporate people talk about, the creative class in our culture. In fact, there's a wonderful book out. We use it in a DMin class I taught. I remember the subtitle is The Rise of the Creative Class of Clergy. Somebody wants to Google that and find it for me. I just can't remember. Faith Stories, maybe. Anyway, it's a book of stories of clergy who over the last 4 to 5 years have emerged as what almost like a Silicon Valley kind of mentality. There's this emerging mindset that says everything can be innovated and can be open to creativity. So one of the opportunities that we have is to look for people that often have looked at our traditional programmatic models and said, nah, you don't need me. You don't need me. That looks like what I grew up with, and I'm not interested in repeating that. So I would suggest that probably in every church, there are some people lurking on the edges who think you don't appreciate what they do and how they think. They think out of the box, they're imaginative, they're creative. They may look a little different, they may be a little nerdy, but they're waiting for somebody to say, can you help us with a Zoom seminar? I was on a call with a group this week, and there's a guy running, is their Zoom master, we call him. And he is probably one of the oddest people I've run across in a while. Reminds me of some of my church members. But I watch those people, let him do what he does on the Zoom call, and he is at home. He's a digital native. Now, he doesn't have the EQ of that rocking chair over there, but he can do this, and he is more alive. The pastor was telling me, this guy's come to life as we've let him help us with our Zoom classes, all that kind of thing. I think we have to create permission. This is an opportunity to re-engage people's imaginations and their artistic side, so to speak. You know, the American culture usually cooks that out of us about age 11. When did you quit putting up on the refrigerator your paintings for your mom and dad? You know, and truth is, what we know about the human being is that there's still a creative urge in all of us that gets ironed out flat by the corporate world or by the institutional church. I always love the stories of the 62-year-olds who retire and go take a class at the community college and discover they're a painter. It's been in there the whole time, and that we just didn't give it permission to come out. So this is a season of innovation and creativity if we take advantage of it. And the biblical idea is you infuse, you inject joy and hope where others see despair and fear. Okay? Is this glass half full or glass empty? Half empty. And, you know, I'm not saying be a naive optimist, but I am saying be Jesus. Look around and find people who others have kind of given up on and say, Peter, you're the guy. You failed me, but you're the rock. And name some people, give them a reason, you know, to reconnect and to be joyful and hopeful about what's coming. That's easier said than done, I know. Number two, I think it's an opportunity, and healthy churches are doing this, to pull back and go back to why are we here? Let's go back to our stories of survival and thriving in previous seasons of significant challenge. There's a spiritual DNA in every congregation, and it's usually fueled by our forefathers and mothers who made great sacrifices so that we could be here. Let's tell those stories. When I pastored in Georgia, we discovered that we were going into a major building campaign. It was a God-sized model, far beyond what we could do. And we needed some first-class inspiration. I started reading our church history. This church, First Baptist in Dalton, Georgia, had been used by the Union soldiers on their march from Chattanooga to burn Atlanta as a field hospital, and they had so desecrated the building that the church people burned the building down when the Union soldiers pulled out. Not the Union soldiers, the church people burned it down. They said, we don't ever want to go back in there again. Post-Civil War, there's no money. They dug out the foundation and they put a roof on it, and they met in that basement for 10 years. In dark, with oil lamps, and the church started growing. And finally, one of their members said, I'm tired of meeting down here. You know, get tuberculosis, come to church. He gave $10,000, which at the time was probably worth $10 million. They built a sanctuary. They slowly pulled themselves out, talked about sacrifice. I started telling those stories that made our little struggle look like nothing. So one of the things I would urge you, and I watch 5 or 6 worship services a Sunday, and most of the time I'm a little disappointed. Because what I hear is theory disconnected from real life. What I would urge you to do, every week you ought to interview someone who's got a faith journey story. I mean, if nothing else, interview every nurse and doc and PA that you can find about what's it like for you during this pandemic. Interview school teachers, interview parents. How are you managing this? Tell stories over and over, because stories reveal what matters most about a church. Some of those stories can be relevant to the current situation. Some can be, tell us about World War II, rationing, and what it was like to keep this church going then. Yeah, okay. Tell us about the story after the fire, after the hurricane, after the tornado, whatever. After the big split. And if you need ideas, start preaching and teaching out of Acts. That's the church in the midst of the most intense season of persecution and resistance that we've ever known. And there are lessons there. I did a 15-month study, verse by verse, on Acts on Wednesday nights, and it changed our church. And I've never been the same, and I think our people were never the same. This is language I've become real attached to. Every congregation needs to occasionally ask, what's at the center of our life? And many of us, if we were honest, would say, we're building centric. When we talk about our church, we're talking about coming to a building, a facility, an address, a room, a sanctuary. Others are pastor centric. Well, it's all about Brother Danny. It's all about Sister Susie. And the center of every congregation tells a great deal about who they are and how they're going to manage this pandemic. Sadly, many of our churches are so focused on our programming, we actually think that's who we are. I had a lady ask me one time, Wednesday nights, that's biblical, right? I said, wait a minute, show me the verse. Well, I know it's in there somewhere, because we were talking about changing the schedule. So we get real confused about what's at our center. Now, I want to lead congregations away from building pastor program-centric models. And by the way, the pandemic has certainly helped us with that, hasn't it? We've gotten to see that, the building, while it's wonderful, it's a great tool and an asset, it is not at the center of who we are. But what should be, what is? You've been around me 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about mission. The congregations I see thriving in and through this pandemic are the ones who are reconnecting and recentering on their mission, reconnecting with why we're here. And it's more about people than things. And it's not just people who are members, it's the city, it's the community. I said to a group of clergy the other day, every one of you is now a parish priest. They were a bunch of Baptists. They said, well, what do you mean priest? Well, what I mean is the city is your parish, not just the members of your congregation. We know that 85 to 90% of the people in your city are not attending a church on a given Sunday, even virtually. They need a pastor. They need someone to care for them. And that means that we begin to think not just about us, but about them. So from a self-serving, self-focused, internally wired congregation to a community, other-focused congregation. This pandemic, gang, has given you permission to quit being a chaplain to a private club and start being a pastor to a community. Don't miss it. Now, if all you want to do is be a chaplain, good for you. Be sure you take some classes on hospice, because you're going to be burying that church. You can be a hospice chaplain. But if you want to blend the chaplaincy role, which is a good one, with the prophetic pastoral role to a community, that's the best of both. Don't pick either or. Remember, it's a both and. And changing that focus from an internal building programmatic clergy focus to an external mission people focus will get you kind of the best of both of those. Bottom line, it's a good opportunity to rediscover Jesus for a lot of churches. We kind of kicked into the curb a while back, and we got so focused on our buildings and our programs, and look at us. Aren't we special? And we left him for, we just assumed he was okay with all this. I think it's a great time to go back and study the life and person of Jesus. How did he respond to seasons of stress, as opposed to the disciples? You know what he did? He went down, he went deeper, not just wider. You remember John 6? Jesus wasn't afraid to say, look, gang, this is going to get tough. And you remember what happened in John 6:66? Many who had followed him pulled away and no longer followed. And he turned to the disciples and said, what about you guys? What are you going to do? And that great line, where would we go? Only you had the words of eternal life. Let's go back to that. Let's get back to all the trappings gone away. This is the man around whom we can organize our life, our witness, our ministry, and everything else is secondary. We will seek first the life, the reign, the kingdom of Jesus, and everything else will fall into place. And this is a chance, I think, right now for thriving churches to reconnect with Jesus. When I talk about collaborative, understand this is an easy word to say and a really hard word to do. I see a lot of clergy, denominations. I would never say colleges because actually, Danny, you guys are one of the few places I see that actually practice collaborative ministry, and I'm grateful for it. But let's start doing collaborative. Be genuine partners. No church can do everything they need to do without help. And the illusion that somehow we're big enough to pull this thing off is going to get us in trouble. One of the things I've seen, the thriving churches I'm aware of, in the midst of this, have been humbled a bit. We thought it was about our building. We thought it was about our super cool programs, our gym, whatever. And what they've had to realize is we can only do our part of the ministry. We need to find some partners to do this with. And if I'm you, when Danny West says we care about the local church, take him up on it. When give these guys and others like them, your denomination, whoever you are, whether it's Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, find the people there who actually care about the local church, not building up the kingdom of the enterprise, 2 levels up, and hook up with them. Beware of prideful folks and find other humble human beings. The old Clint Eastwood line, it wasn't exactly this, but it's something like, a church has got to know its limitations. You can't do everything. And find some people to help you do this. One of the things in our work in a Lilly-funded project we're doing right now in Nashville is we're finding that collaborative spirit founded in humility is one of the key predictors for success for the 2020s. And prideful, too large to fail, that kind of thinking is one of the key predictors for failure. All right, rebalancing our internal and external portfolio. By this, I mean the whole notion that where your treasure is, there is your heart. Where have we been spending most of our money, our staffing assignments, our committee structure, and our organizational energy? Well, it's been focused on us. Most age group ministers, most music educators, even pastors spend 90 to 95% of their time servicing internal constituents, meaning church members. Go look at your budget and tell me how many dollars you spend overtly on issues, opportunities, people outside the membership of the family. And a lot of times I'll do a little game, and I think we may have done it at Westchester, where we say, where do you think Jesus spent most of his time? Internally, working with the disciples, or externally, engaging with people outside the family of faith? And you know what people usually say? Somewhere in that middle, maybe even tipping over into the external side. And then I'll say, well, how about you? How about you, Pastor? Let's look at your calendar last week. And I'm guilty. 98% of my time was focused on church members, and almost like, the concierge pastor. How can I help you? Kind of at the beck and call of pastoral of congregational members. How do we rebalance that portfolio so that it's a little more like what maybe Jesus intended? So it has to do with money, our structures, meaning how we're organized, what people are asked to do, where they give their energy and time, and the life of the church. Is it simply maintaining the institution, or is it truly engaging people outside the family of faith? Now, here we go, Jerry, staffing model. One of the things that is predictor of how engaged a congregation is in the life of the community is, what is your staff hired to do? And the 20th century model was a programmatic model. Staff were hired, and I was a product in 1980 of seminary. I was a programmatic master, right? I was a youth minister par excellence. I had 300 kids in my youth group. I had 4 employees. I mean, we were a gigantic machine, but you had to come to us. And, it was all about come to our stuff. And man, people did. We didn't have a lot of competition. Oh, and by the way, I was also full-time minister of recreation with 600 people in that program. We were running programs like crazy. And then we began to ask, how much of this is just sort of servicing the family versus how much of this is engaging people who have no faith community and no faith commitment? Oh, did saying a prayer before a basketball game, was that enough? So we began to rethink that. Thoughtful churches are asking these kind of questions around their staffing model. If we actually think the future of our church needs to be more externally focused than it has been, then somebody on our staff or everyone on our staff needs to have that cooked into their job description. And then we do a staff study. Where are you spending your money? And the alignment question comes when you realize you're spending your money on staffing that actually supports a model of ministry that is fading from the scene. A siloed, programmatic model where we overinvest in servicing the membership and we underinvest in engaging the world. So here's a prediction. By 2025, everyone in ministry will be a part of a church where someone on your staff is either by title or responsibility charged with being the online community pastor. And I don't mean somebody who's just savvy with Facebook. I mean someone who actually knows how to minister to the online community. Now, there's some people out there ahead of us. You don't have to invent this thing from scratch. But fewer and fewer people are going to be hired to just come and provide services for our members, kind of like a country club. And more, we're going to hire people and create positions, certainly help us with the people who are already in the house, but also help us with the not yets. So, Jerry, I go back to the music ministry model. A friend of mine in Denver, we were having this conversation similar to your church, and they came up with, we're going to try this for 1 year. Every staff, they had 4 staff members: music, youth, adult, pastor, and maybe a children's person. They said, we want you to spend 20% of your time engaged in ministry with non-church members. And we don't mean go to have lunch at the high school with kids and count that. We actually want you to be actively engaged with non-Christian, non-church members. And this is not an event, this is an alliance church, if you know Baptist life. This is a very progressive church. Well, the music minister looked at him and said, I've been doing 25 years. All I know to do is, have great choirs. Well, 1 day a week, 1 out of 5, you got to be off campus. You can't even come on campus. You know what he did? He started, about that time, the Denver school systems eliminated all arts and music from their curriculum as a cost-saving measure. You know what he did? He went and he started a community choir. And he loved it, by the way, because people came because they wanted to, not because Mama drug them on, Wednesday nights to church choir. And he said, oh, by the way, our concerts are Sunday at 11. You're the worship choir for XYZ church. And in no time, this guy came to life because suddenly he remembered part of why he got into this thing was not just to provide maintenance service to people already in the house, but to engage people in music in a kind of life-giving way. So the staffing model needs to change. And then you got to ask, do we have the right people? The old question, right people in the right seats on the bus? And that's a harder question. And I think, Jerry, that's part of the challenge is, how do you, it's one thing to say we want to be more engaged in life of the community, and the virus has certainly pushed us out of the church. But what happens if somebody says, yeah, no, that's not for me, sorry. Well, then do you adapt your mission to your staff, or do you adapt your staff to your mission? And sadly, the former is generally how churches do it, because we love Bill. He's been a great guy. He's been wonderful. I had this conversation yesterday with a pastor. And she was telling me, I've got a staff member who's 27 years on the job. Problem is, this is a receptionist who doesn't like computers. And so, we've had to farm out all the tech stuff to people who it's not their job. And so finally you say, look, are we going to let the preferences of the staff member drive the mission? Or are we going to say, we're staffing to the mission? And I'm sorry, if that's not yours, then we'll help you find something else. It's a hard call, I get it, but sometimes it has to happen. And finally, I think one way churches are thriving is it has forced us to recover what we call the missional fervor or passion and calling of why we're here. Not what we do. A lot of our what and our how has been swept away by the pandemic, but our why hasn't. And thoughtful clergy are leading their churches to rethink, why are we here? If we can't meet in the building, or if it's a compromised situation and we have no nursery and we're warning off anybody over 65, it's not really, that's, what have you done here? So why are we here? And if it's not more than just, we're here to put on a good show every Sunday, then you're in trouble. But the truth is, I know the more you peel this onion down, people get re-energized by rediscovering why. The why drives everything. If you know Simon Sinek's work in the corporate world, The Power of Why, he's got a great TED Talk and all kinds of cool stuff about rediscovering why we're here. And I think that's really what Jesus did to the Jewish people. They had gotten caught up in the form and function, the what and the how. They were more about ritual and about, dietary laws and don't touch this, don't eat that, wash your hands 17 times a day. And he came back and said, wait a minute, love God and love other people, and let's go make disciples. And that really is based in Old Testament scripture. And he reminded them why God came. God did not come to create this archaic institution that would bore people to death. And that's what they were doing. And what he was saying to them is what he would say to us. This is a chance to re-engage your why. To be the people of light, salt, in a world that's desperately dark and without flavor. Come on, there's never been a better day to be about that than right now. So that's what I got for you. The summary, If you think survival skills, these are the things I'm seeing. And then if you think thriving skills, these are the things I'm seeing. So let me stop and what do you think? Helpful? Stating the obvious? Not helpful? What would you add? I'm open to critique or constructive criticism because this is an ongoing conversation for me. Aaron, you got anything for me?
No, someone did ask if the name of that book was Secret Habits, The Rise of the Creative Clergy.
That's it.
Okay.
It's a great piece. It's a great little piece. We use it in the D-Min seminar on entrepreneurial leadership. And it's just stories of people doing creative things. I love the idea of the rise of the creative clergy. That imagery is powerful to me.
Another person echoed I didn't sign up to follow Jesus to be a concierge pastor. So they gave you an amen to that statement.
Oh.
That's it for the chat window right now. Is there anybody else who'd like to unmute themselves and ask a question? Tyler, go ahead.
I see that hand.
Yeah, I mostly work with the youth and children at our church, and now I've become technology and properties management as well. But anyhow,
Congratulations, by the way.
thank you. I think it would be really helpful to have some continuing conversation around the culture of call, especially with high school and college students, because I always feel like I have that culture of call. I talk about calling as much as we're together. However, I also don't want to pigeonhole a student's future well-being. So I generally have a wide berth on that conversation as far as calling can be within whatever you do.
Right.
But generally that's not going to send somebody to divinity school to study church history and biblical, so I would welcome some more conversation, maybe not right now, but about how to steer that culture of call towards, ministry. Because I know how important that was for me and still is for me. And I'm a clergy son. My dad's a minister as well. So anyway.
Real quick, I'll say one of the things that influenced me most was an earlier Lilly project called the Samuel Project. I don't know if y'all remember that, but it was a wonderful idea that came out of BTSR, where you paired up a Samuel, which was a kind of mentor, someone who was called to ministry, an Eli, and what was Samuel's mother's name? Sarah? Anyway, the family that would commit. So you had these three parts. Yeah, Hannah. So you'd have a Hannah, they would commit. So that's an interesting thing. The other thing I would say, the culture of call is not just about clergy. It's that everyone is called. And so one of the things we started doing on Senior Sunday, this is a real quick one, we would ask our seniors, we went away from the old cap and gown, come up here and, hey, I'm Bill, I'm going to Georgia, go Dogs, kind of crap. All that stuff. And we'd say, all right, Bill, we want you to stand up. I want you to finish this sentence. Hi, my name is Bill. My mission in life is, and next year my mission is taking me to blank. See, we had to teach, and we juniors and seniors, we helped them formulate a personal mission statement for their life. What is God's call? What is God's mission for you? And so we had plenty of people stand and say, my mission in life is to be the finest medical doctor I can be. And next year, my mission is taking me to the University of Illinois, where I'll study pre-med. Well, that was as meaningful to them as somebody saying, I want to be a youth minister, and I'm going to, Shorter or whatever. But that whole notion, Tyler, that call is something more than that's vocare, if you know Latin, vocation. It's more than a job. And it's funny, when we started doing that, young adults started showing up saying, I want to know more about that call thing. As one guy said, I got all the money you can ever imagine. I have no meaning in my life. And we had, so anyway. Any other comments or questions? I'm watching the clock. I don't want to keep you too long, but we could talk all day about some of this stuff.
I do have a couple in the chat window here.
Okay.
First one says, a word or two, please, about how this may apply to denominational leaders.
That doesn't apply to them, no. Oh, listen, pray for denominational leaders because they are working so hard to keep things afloat. I don't care if you're PCUSA, PCA, CBF, SBC, NABC, they're all in decline. Most of them are managing decline. And it's really hard to do that and keep people engaged and energetic around the mission. So it is not an easy task. And I have, all of us have good friends in those roles who are working hard at it. What they need is people like you and me to be supportive of them as much as we can. But when CBF has to cut, when their annual missions giving is dropping by 25% in 1 year, did you see that? From 4+ million to less than 3 million. It tells you what the future is not good for our denominational bodies. I don't care. And I work with SBC, every denomination you can imagine, they're all facing a cliff in 2021. Because the way churches have balanced their budgets, because you did it. Because you kept that money back so you could keep your staff fully employed. And they're in deep trouble. So it's hard to be creative when you're struggling to exist. It's one thing to be creative when you've got time and you're not worried about whether you're going to get a paycheck. But 10 people got laid off at CBF last week. And BGAV is about to lay off another round. I mean, when you're worried about survival, it's hard to be real creative. So be careful around them and thoughtful and supportive if you possibly can. And what was the other one, Aaron?
We'll do one more quick one, and then we do want to be respectful of the time that people have given here. The last one from the chat window, let's see. Given what you have presented, do you see more doors opening for women in ministry, especially as preachers and pastors?
I do. Not in every denomination, but already it's kind of like the medical field. More women are in med school than men, and that's certainly going to be true, if not already, in divinity school. It's coming. Some kicking and screaming, but it's coming, and the more good examples we have, the better. Hey, thank you, gang, for showing up. Danny, thank you for letting this happen and for your ongoing commitment to the church. I can't say enough about Gardner-Webb. Aaron, thank you for your help today.
Absolutely.
Danny, you want to say a word?
Yeah, Aaron, thanks to you for being our site administrator. Bill, always value the time to hear your perspective. And the one thing that I truly appreciate is that while we all sit in our silos, to borrow your term, it's good to collectively pool our silos and to hear from one another. And so I'm grateful. And thanks to all of you for being a part of this opportunity. There will be others. And God willing, one of these days, perhaps Bill and I will be coming to your town.
Who knows? We might even get to do that tour. We'll grab Tracy and you can be our driver, Tracy. How about that?
All right. Well, blessings to you all again. Thanks. And as always, know that we are all available to you should you have a need.
Absolutely.
Or something we can help you with in our ministry. Blessings to you all. Have a great day.
Take care, everyone.
Uh-huh.